Good afternoon, everyone. For those that don't know me, thank you. I'm Zoe Rijn. I'm the director here at the Hammer Museum, and I am absolutely delighted to welcome so many of you here this afternoon. As I am sure many of you are well aware, we are in for a real treat today, as art historian John Walsh will give his fourth and final lecture on the evolution of Henri Matisse's work. He will focus on the artist's later years as he adapted his techniques in the face of chronic illness, still managing to create a number of incredible artworks. First of all, I'd love to see a show of hands. How many of you have attended one of these lectures, or maybe one of John's other lectures, or watched them online? Let me see. Oh my goodness, absolutely everybody. Well, you all know then how special these lectures are. And if this is your first, I'm sure you'll thoroughly enjoy today's lecture by John. It sort of goes without saying then to such a knowledgeable audience, but for those that don't know, John Walsh started his career as a curator of paintings at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, before coming to Los Angeles in 1983 to become the director of the Getty Museum, a position he held for 17 years. During that time, John transformed the museum through strategic acquisitions, as well as overseeing the creation of the Getty Center. Although he retired from the Getty in 2000, he has stayed very busy as an art historian, an in-demand lecturer, and most importantly for us here at the Hammer, a long-time and beloved board member. Even in my short time at the museum over the last year, I have benefited enormously from John's insights, his guidance, and his abundance of encouragement and enthusiasm. Since 2019, John has presented many lectures at the Hammer, including on Rembrandt, Van Gogh, Cézanne, and Mondrian. And all of these are available to watch on the Hammer channel. All of the Matisse lectures are there as well. And if you really want to dive much deeper into Matisse, John has also generously shared a reading list that you can also find on our website. I hope you'll stick around after today's lecture for some coffee and tea and cookies with John right outside in the theatre lobby. But before we start, I'd also like to quickly highlight two upcoming programmes that I hope you'll come back for. On Saturday, February 28th, we will have our third annual Voices of the Diaspora Symposium organised by the Asian American Pacific Islander Arts Network, and featuring artists and cultural workers exploring art histories through the lens of migration and globalization. And on the evening of Wednesday, March 4th, we are excited to welcome Pulitzer Prize-winning art critic and longtime New Yorker writer Hilton Als back to the Hammer for a lecture on the work of photographer Diane Arbus. Hilton, exactly, I hear you. Hilton is a brilliant critic, and as some of you know, was also the guest curator for the Hammer's 2022 exhibition, Joan Didion, What She Means. Finally, I want to thank all of you for spending your Sunday afternoon with us, and especially this glorious Sunday afternoon. And I especially want to extend my gratitude to the Hammer members and supporters who make programs like this possible. In fact, today has been almost like a perfect encapsulation of so much of what the Hammer does best. In our galleries, and it was packed today, which was fantastic. We have our Made in LA biannual. You have one more week to see this, which is really a celebration of 28 artists living and working across the LA region. Earlier this afternoon, we had dozens of families participating in our weekly art lab, art making workshops. And now we have this wonderful lecture, which is a beautiful offering to those of you like me who are lifelong learners and find joy in deepening our understanding of art. So thank you so much for being here. And now Please join me in a warm welcome for John Walsh.
Speaking while we're thanking people, I'd like to thank you, Zoe, wherever you've gotten to, for having risen to the top of the profession, having agreed to be the director of the Hammer Museum. It's going to be wonderful. Has been already. I also want to thank Claudia Bestor, who couldn't be here today, and her right hand, Shannon Sinova, who makes things happen. All of this seems easy, but it's not. And so, and they make it easy for the speaker too. On we go with Matisse. Here he is again in his late 40s, working in a hotel room in Nice with a view of the Mediterranean. He'd been fairly successful as a painter and comfortably off. He thrived in the southern climate, well away from the hustle and grit of Paris. His subjects for the next 10 years were often comfortable rooms inhabited by attractive young women, clothed or unclothed, often exotically costumed. Matisse had made his name in Paris a dozen years earlier, first as an unconventional, dazzling colorist, and he was controversial for that. He had built an international clientele, including Gertrude Stein and her brothers, and her friends, the Cohn sisters from Baltimore, and also Sergei Shishkin, who was a kind of cultivated oligarch with advanced tastes in contemporary art and a palace in Moscow to display it. During the teens, the Cubist years, Matisse had found new ways of distorting pictorial space and disassembling pictorial illusions and reassembling them. Matisse found that he could work on a scale bigger than life and come close to abstraction. But he was never committed to abstraction, and he could paint the same domestic subject cryptically at first, and then over again, more traditionally. All his life, Matisse reveled in color and pattern and created entire environments with them. He produced many hundreds of paintings and drawings and prints of nude women, some sculptures as well. All the work had agreeable subjects, delicious colors, often intriguing settings, and sometimes novel compositions. Some artists and critics thought he'd lost his edge, but his dealers loved him, and his pictures sold, and he had an orderly business managed by his wife Amélie, there in the center, and his adult daughter Marguerite, and a bit later by his son Pierre, who became an art dealer. Approaching 50, however, he felt malaise. He felt increasingly depleted, blank, getting nowhere. He wrote Marguerite, "In front of the canvas, I have no ideas whatsoever." We ended here in the last lecture with a picture that he'd started, but he couldn't finish. And it's the one that seems to preoccupy him the most. We'll come back to it. One bit of good news in 1929 was that he was going to have 4 exhibitions in Basel, in Berlin, Paris, and in New York at the brand new Museum of Modern Art. The bad news was that he felt even more stalled and anxious than usual. In 1930, in hopes of clearing his head, he sailed away on the Ile-de-France for 6 months, minus his wife, who couldn't travel because of her fragile health. The destination was French Polynesia. First he landed in New York, which enchanted him, except for Broadway, which he said was infernal. It's it's the only thing I've seen that I can't stand. Here he's sitting in the East Side, with the Queensboro Bridge behind him. He headed west towards Polynesia, west by train to Chicago, Las Vegas, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and then by sea to Tahiti. And he spent a couple of months exploring, hardly painting at all, but making drawings and writing home about the astounding vegetation, swimming, describing what he says, quivering of the waters, the trade winds rustling in the cocoa palms, and like silk, the impression of power, of fullness and completion. He camped out on location where the German director Friedrich Murnau was shooting his schlocky romance, Tobu. Still, he managed to fret about being away. He wrote home, "I've always in my mind turned to the works that I left behind, my yellow dress, still to be finished, and my sculptures." Well, he came back to New York to serve as judge for the Carnegie Prize, which he'd already won and which he awarded to his friend Picasso. Matisse made the cover of Time magazine, where the story said, "Reporters and hostesses found him silent behind his whiskers and only occasionally willing to act the oracle. I do not like Tahiti," he said. "I'm not Gauguin. I could never paint there. Now, New York, that is different. I should like to paint in New York," which, of course, he never did. To appreciate how Matisse pulled himself together, pulled himself out of his midlife crisis, let's have a look at the yellow dress and then compare this picture on the right of 7 years later. This was something new and different. She's not lounging around dressed for the harem. She's sitting formally, dressed comme il faut, as though she were going to a garden party, sunbonnet and all. She's in Matisse's studio. You recognize the tiles and the wild wallpaper and the shutters and the blue sky out the window, blue sea out the window. Her frontal pose is familiar, like many French and English portraits. First, though, Matisse had experimented on paper over and over. I've picked out just 2 of the dozen-odd drawings for this painting. It's started at the top, as you can see, with much the same setup, but in a wider angle view, with the settee off to the right. Then he gave her a relaxed pose, leaning back, arms outstretched. And so it went for another dozen drawings, getting simpler and more emphatic, and ending up in what we see. After he started painting, he kept reworking it. She kept getting bigger. You can see the abandoned outlines under the top layers of paint that he's adjusted. The forearm, he's repainting the neck and collarbone right over the necklace. He doesn't sweat the finer points. You notice her left arm, where he doesn't bother to supply an outline for the inner part. He gets the look of shot silk by floating or scribbling greenish gray over the pale yellow, and then hitting the outlines in black. The painting took several years, a trip to Tahiti, and many sittings before Matisse was satisfied by it. 6 years later, the woman in blue is flat, like a poster by comparison to the woman in yellow, like a playing card. He doesn't try even to suggest that this is a person with weight or volume who exists in 3 dimensions. Yes, there is a nod at volume in the billowing skirt and the sleeves, and we take for granted that she must be in front of the seat cushion. but old-fashioned illusion is finished for Matisse. Here, the picture is all about color and line, color to organize it into blue zones, red zones, black zones, and so forth. Her hands are absurdly large, but for a reason, so you don't miss what they're doing. One pointing to her head, her mind, and idly holding her beads. Vanity, piety, take your pick. Here's the sitter, Lydia Delektorskaya, his principal model and studio assistant, wearing the outfit that she seems to have designed herself. Her poise, and particularly her hand gesture, would have been recognized by anybody familiar with the old masters of the previous generation. This is Ingres, his portrait of Madame Moitessier, who's a little less explicit, pointing to her own brain, but I think the message is similar. Not just a pretty face. Between the yellow dress and this flat, bold, witty image, Matisse has turned a corner. A great deal had happened. After he got back from Tahiti, Matisse took on two laborious projects that had changed his life. Both of them had involved media and techniques that were new to him: public murals and book designs. Both required a versatility that very few artists had, to work on an intimate scale and a large public scale. The first was intimate. Illustrated book, this one of poems by the great Stéphane Mallarmé, which we'll return to. Overlapping it was the decoration of a room in America open to the public with giant murals. Matisse had met with the Philadelphia collector Albert Barnes, who'd made a fortune from a patent antiseptic called Argyrol, and had been forming a collection of paintings by post-impressionists and others who conformed to his own ideas of modernism. He'd been buying Cézanne and Matisse and others aggressively, the way he did everything. He had this house and gallery in the suburbs built for the collection and opened to the public in 1925. Matisse went to see him in 1930. Two intense personalities, if ever there were. And soon Barnes commissioned Matisse to paint murals for him. Murals for three enormous empty spaces above the windows in his central gallery, each 12 feet high. For Matisse, who'd come back from Tahiti calmer, but unsure of what to do with himself next, the timing was perfect. The project consumed him for a year and a half, and after many struggles, it restored him. He decided on the subject without consulting Barnes in advance. It was going to be the dance, a return to the theme of one of the 10-foot-high pictures of the dance and music that he'd painted 20 years earlier for his Russian patron, Sergei Shishkin. The dance had been based on a small but central detail of his own painting, The Joy of Life, there at the bottom, which Barnes now owned. A round dance of nude women in an enchanted, colorful landscape. Shishkin's picture was over life-size, red-skinned, nude women in a circle, full of joyous vitality, one of them almost falling down. Matisse was going to have to fill 3 lunettes, so he needed a composition that somehow divided the action into 3 parts. He also had to find himself a studio in Nice that could hold them, so he rented a big empty garage not far from where he was living. Matisse had to design paintings that would be legible from far below. He also needed to invent a process for painting on such a huge scale. he made many small sketches to test this composition and try out the colors. Now, here are 4 of them. And at the right, you see his 11-foot-high study on paper of the figure at the center standing on 1 foot. What Matisse didn't want to do is follow the usual practice of making normal-sized drawings and then scaling them up onto the painting surface by squaring them or even projecting them. Instead, here was his new technique. He laid out the compositions directly onto the canvases, drawing with charcoal on a 6-foot stick. He was convinced that his own energy could be transferred to the work. He wrote, "The composition came out of hand-to-hand combat with the 52 square meters of surface of which my mind had to take possession, and not the modern method of projection of composition on a much larger surface." An expert on Matisse, Yves Lambois, described him as having a few sessions with a model, posing in many different attitudes, filling 2 sketchbooks with what Bois called the singularity of movement or the posture in just a few strokes. The drawings are minimal, but done in a matter of seconds. Matisse is no longer trying to refine an essence, but to internalize it, to capture it within himself, the very moment that he draws. He wants to draw as if he were dancing. And just as remarkable, in order to transfer the figures to the canvas, he used a collage technique on a huge scale. He actually hired a house painter to apply gouache colors to big sheets of paper, following the color code that you see in the upper left. He had Lydia, the young woman you saw in the blue dress, cut out the shapes that he'd drawn on the big painted sheets. And then they pinned them up. Matisse could then reshape or replace them to change the composition without having to repaint the canvas. A photographer took pictures like the one at the top to record the changes. It was a team effort. And down below, you see an unfinished, full-sized first version that Matisse abandoned. It's hanging in Paris in the Museum of Modern Art at the Palais de Tokyo. I have 45 seconds of home movie to show Matisse at work, or pretend to be for the camera. Yeah, that's his dog. He was called Rowdy, and he got to climb the stairs. I show this mostly because it's very rare footage, and also because you get a sense of the scale, the relation of the figure, that is Matisse, and the huge things he was painting. And again, at the top, you're seeing the huge preparatory collage. Down below is the watercolor study that I believe Matisse showed the impatient Dr. Barnes to pacify him as the work in Nice progressed. You get an idea of the background colors and just how radically abstracted the dancers were going to be. It's become a kind of hectic dance now, a lot of wild leaping and even falling down. Matisse thought the design work was done at this point, and so he went ahead to finish the paintings. But on February 22, 1933, after a year of work, Matisse got this telegram from Barnes: "You have made an enormous error." He said Matisse had used dimensions that were off by several feet. Barnes sailed over to France immediately. They met, and Matisse started all over again. At the top again, you see the design before telegram. In between, Matisse's drawing with a simplified idea for the revision, 3 pairs of dancers, 1 dancer under each spandrel between. It got refined there at the bottom with the same techniques, using paper cutouts, pairs dancing wildly or struggling. It's hard to know which. This was the design that he followed fairly closely in the painted version, which took at least a year to finish. He might have felt joy or at least satisfaction, but it was more like despair again. The artist Henri Matisse recalled that as they walked back to the studio in Nice to have a look at them, I'm quoting Masson now, Matisse suddenly stopped, and after a long silence, he said, "I've lost my touch. Everything I do has gone cold. Remember the canvases I used to paint?" Breton says, "He seemed to have no inkling that he was entering into a new manner, full of sap and vigor, a new phase marked by the miraculous alliance of grace with maturity." After some minor alterations, the 3 huge canvases were rolled up, and they sailed with Matisse to New York and then got trucked down to Philadelphia. Installation shot. The humans in the photograph give you an idea of the scale of those tumbling Amazons. Matisse had a minor heart attack during the installation, and Barnes wasn't in great shape either. His new book on Matisse had just come out and was laughed at by the reviewers as authoritarian and amateurish, which put Barnes in an extremely bad temper. Here is the final product, photographed in the new Barnes Foundation building in Philadelphia that opened a dozen years ago, in a hall that replicates its first setting in the old gallery, but with much better light. The dancers are uniform light gray. The layout is basically symmetrical. The figures are not modeled in 3 dimensions or even articulated, just outlined. Well, I wondered how the room might look if we could get the Barnes to borrow Shoshukin's dance painting from St. Petersburg. And so I thought I would try it digitally. There isn't much left, as you can see, of the single whirling circle of 1909. Just the tremendous energy of 3 separate pairs. Instead of an ensemble number, it's a dance of couples. And 2 of the dancers are sitting it out, seemingly beyond the spandrels, fallen down or just resting or observing. In the center, the couple has uncoupled. One is falling, the other is bending over her. The landscape, rather than being minimal, is non-existent. No allusion to nature, just a background of flat bands of blue and pink and black. Well, while I was fooling with this file, I pulled up the full-size first version, the one that Matisse didn't finish. It had actually disappeared, and it wasn't rediscovered until 1990 in the artist's studio at Nice. And now it's on view at the Museum of Modern Art in the Palais de Tokyo. He wanted to model the musculature at first in 3 dimensions, but the whole thing, I think, is much less coherent than the flatter Barnes version. And before we leave the virtual room, there's a third version hanging in the next gallery in the Palais de Tokyo. Matisse painted it after he returned from the Barnes project in the United States. It's a version, he insisted, not a copy, and one that he hoped would be on view permanently somewhere in France. And he got his wish. And of course, he's made more changes. He couldn't help it. It has fewer dancers, and there's no interaction between the figures. It's this third version, though, that he chose to reproduce in the large color aquatint. For the Barnes mural project, Matisse invented a new method for proceeding, cutouts of colored paper that he could arrange and rearrange any way he wanted. 20 years later, cutouts would become his trademark technique. Meanwhile, he started to another medium that would spread his work further, artists' books, entirely designed by himself as well as illustrated by himself. The timing was perfect. It's a chance that came just as the work on the figures for the Barnes had become bolder and flatter. He'd been making prints for 25 years off and on, beginning with the turn of the century fad for woodcuts, as you just saw, and then making etchings and lithographs, many hundreds of them. He was one of the masters in all history of pure line drawing. In 1932, he was approached by the enterprising 28-year-old Swiss art dealer, Albert Schira, to do an artist's book. Schira had already published Ovid's Metamorphoses with illustrations by Picasso that quite got Matisse's competitive juices flowing. He chose a selection of poems by Stéphane Mallarmé, the great symbolist poet of the previous generation, who had lived through the Impressionist and Post-Impressionist years and had said this: "I am inventing a language that must necessarily spring from a very new poetics, which I could define in these words: paint not the thing, but the effect it produces." And that is just what Matisse had been saying for the 25 years that he'd been trying to do that. He chose the poems, designed the books, and made 30 etchings for it. His images don't illustrate what went on in the poems. Instead, they were his responses, emotional, intellectual, to the effect that the words made on him, the images that they summoned up in him. This maquette is put together by Schira and Matisse together, deluxe collector's items, with preparatory drawings as well as printed pages. This is the drawing for Le Cygne, the swan, about a bird in the dead of winter who's anguished at the thought that he didn't sing when he could have. And Matisse drew the swan from life, hyper-conscientious as he was, correcting the lines over and over. A photographer saw him doing field work, possibly suggested by a publicist for Schira, I suspect so. In the actual etching at the left, Matisse has the bird's neck reversed in a literal backward look, and the wings stretched out even wider. Here's a poem of 7 short stanzas about a mob of desperate beggars on the march who are foiled by a powerful angel of misfortune, the jinx or the scourge. Matisse draws a running female with wild hair, gesticulating, who could have belonged to that troupe of giant faceless dancers that Matisse was just inventing for Dr. Barnes. The headpiece on the right has a hand clenched around a spear, or could it be a pen? A facing page for the Afternoon of a Faun, the poem that Debussy, who wrote a piece based on it, called The Dreams and Desires of a Faun who falls into intoxicating sleep and who finds sleep even better than the real thing. In Matisse's book, there are two of the most affecting portraits of poets anywhere. Two of Mallarmé's predecessors. This is Charles Baudelaire on the left, like a classical bust, a patrician of the Roman Empire, projecting authority and clarity. At the other side, Edgar Allan Poe, who knows the dark side, shown with filmy eyes, meandering nose, swollen jaw and neck. Matisse puts across his feelings about these men and about Mallarmé, using the fewest and the sparest lines he could draw. This was Matisse's most important and largest book. In the years to come, there would be 32 more book projects, and of those, the most ambitious was an edition of James Joyce's Ulysses, which first came out in Paris in 1922 and then got republished in New York in an edition with 6 etchings by Matisse. Here are etchings for 3 of the chapters. Joyce's novel, parallels Homer's Odyssey with events in the contemporary Dublin. So Matisse knew the Odyssey, but it seems he hadn't read Joyce. So the subjects that he etched are from Homer, not from Joyce, except the one at the farthest left for the Circe Chapel, which he knew Joyce had set in a brothel, thus all the flesh. In the middle, the shipwrecked Odysseus on the beach, discovered naked by the Princess Nausicaa and her maidens, who've come down to do the laundry, and they give him some laundry to wear, and they take him back to the castle. At the right, the clever Odysseus has gotten the man-eating Cyclops Polyphemus, gotten him drunk, and while he sleeps, Odysseus drives a burning stick into his one eye. These are etchings. Matisse introduces some shading on a soft etching ground to make the figures more legible, unlike the flat Barnes dancers. Books could be designed at home in Nice, where Matisse could relax now and then, especially where there was a photographer around. Here he's sitting near a portrait he had drawn of the collector in Baltimore, Etta Cohn. And over the fireplace just above him is one of the Ulysses drawings. The great big picture on the wall is one that he just finished, and I'm pretty sure he hoped Etta Cohn would buy when she came to Paris. We're back to the Matisse's first love, sumptuous fabrics, compositions generated by a hunger for color and for the comforts of home. Here, it's one fabric overlapping another, both on top of wild pink wallpaper and exuberant magnolia leaves springing from a blue and white pot, all floating above the familiar red tile floor. And there's the dog, Rowdy. You met him in the studio. That's where he gets to nap, on this checkered blanket. Meanwhile, there was trouble in the household. Matisse's wife, Amélie, had been invalid for several years, and more estranged from Matisse. living in an apartment above the studio until she moved out. Matisse persuaded her to return, and since Amélie was having trouble keeping help, she suggested bringing back Lydia, the part-time assistant for the studio, who was a smart and efficient young Russian émigré. You've met her already, to manage things. She's there at the left, discreetly between her employers. Very soon, she was indispensable for Amélie as well as for the household. Matisse was always himself an anxious workaholic, but now he was having heart trouble and nerve pain and insomnia and various other elements. Lydia described herself as stretcher bearer. One product of their collaboration is the picture that Lydia has on the easel, a painting by Matisse of herself, for which she was modeling and for which she's helping to progress through months of sittings and changes. Here's the finished painting. Matisse has returned to his main subject in the previous decade, the nude figure. She's only 3 feet wide, but this picture has the audacious flatness of the dancing giants that he painted for Barnes, but now in a collapsed picture space with props, all of which took months to evolve. Now Matisse was not only reworking his compositions, but also having them photographed at each stage. This sequence runs from the top left to the right, and then the middle, and then the bottom. And in the blue box, but just by the way, you can see that he used his new techniques, his patches of cutout paper, to rework the curve of her lower back. This shows you the main changes, I think. In the top left, in the month of May, she's on a chaise longue in the corner of the room, and she has a relatively realistic face. Behind her is a Renaissance-style chair and a vase of flowers. In the middle picture, 13 weeks later, she's bigger, and her legs are repositioned. The chair and the flowers are different, and she's on a blanket that's with squares. And up the upper right, Matisse makes a charcoal drawing of her in a pose that goes back to the rotated posture that he started with. When he's finished, 8 weeks later, everything has been redrawn. The provocative twist of the torso is eliminated. Her body is bigger and smaller. Head is smaller, sits upright. Her features are stylized. The blanket's a grid. The chair is just a pair of volutes hiding out behind the flowers, which have morphed into a yellow mass. Her skin is a uniform pink, what Matisse called prawn pink. The result is a strange caricature of proportions and volume and picture space, even of color. All those elements are there, but progressively abstracted. And if we flash back 10 or 12 years, it's clear that the element of erotic fantasy has been damped down. What have we got instead? I'll let that question hang for just a bit and move on and point out that being a model for Matisse was no easy thing. It was real work, but Lydia did it for about 10 years. And there's something spontaneous and often funny about the relationship. That's especially true when there's a mirror and Matisse includes himself. Both of these pictures are a game of who's seeing what. And it's kind of a puzzle for you. Taking the one at the left, Matisse, way back there, can see the entire room and we don't. We only see what he wants us to. He shows himself looking at Lydia, who's looking at him, and therefore at us. She's looking at him and us, and she sees the rest of the room, but she can't see her own mirror image, which the artist and we can see. Her half profile and the bumbling hair tumbling on the back of her head. I think this is a brain teaser with metaphorical overtones. We see different things which are not in conflict. We can't see everything, and certainly not at once from our individual viewpoints. Lydia was versatile. You have seen her look regal in rich fabrics, the crown of flowers behind her head, carrying the authority of ease and chic. On the right, she relaxes. Her striped robe has a languorous pattern like the other things in her surroundings, the wavy wallpaper and the twisted vase. She's at ease in the midst of a kind of riot of restless, colorful things. And here she is again, in a different solution to the same setup. In the painting on the left, similar size and composition, with a lot of differences. And it's worth taking a minute just for you to look at all these things and perhaps decide which you prefer, which you would take home from the dealers, and why. That will give me a chance to have a swallow of water, and then maybe I'll take a poll, so decide. So, which will it be? The picture on the right or the picture on the left? First off, hands up for the picture on the right. Click, 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 click. Okay, picture on the left. Okay, right by a hair. I'm going to turn for a moment to another new medium for Matisse, new for Matisse at least, the stage. It was 20 years earlier when, at the end of World War I, Sergei Diaghilev, there at the left, pictured with Stravinsky, had persuaded Picasso up top to do sets and costumes for his Ballet Russe in Paris, which Picasso did very successfully. When Diaghilev then offered Matisse the chance to do a new piece he could not resist, it was called The Song of the Nightingale, with music by Stravinsky and choreography by Leonard Massine, who was posed at the left there with Matisse and the Nightingale and behind them. The ballet was adapted from a fairy tale by Hans Christian Andersen. It's about the Emperor of China and a nightingale whose gorgeous improvised songs the emperor loved, until the Emperor of Japan sent him a mechanical nightingale whose nice regular tunes the courtiers loved. The real one flew away, and the emperor became sick almost to the death. But of course, in the last act, the real nightingale returns, the live one, and the emperor lives. Matisse's stage design was simple, and the costumes were relatively severe, austere, designed to catch the light in various settings, but they were a struggle to make, and they involved work by Matisse himself. There was always a hands-on type in the costume shop. The ballet was a flop, but some costumes do survive. Matisse got another shot at the ballet in 1938 when Massin asked him to do sets and costumes for a piece set to Shostakovich's First Symphony. The company was divided into 4 squads, each squad in white with its own colored ribbons, you see at the bottom, as ornament. It was a reprise, the set was, at the left, of Dr. Barnes's Three Arches. The movement was heavily stylized. In Paris, it got good, if puzzled, reviews. When Matisse brought the production to New York, when Massin took the production to New York later in the year, the New York Times reviewer thought that it was too abstract and singled out Matisse's setting as the single greatest handicap of the production. A child of this ballet was his design for an enormous stage curtain that he laid out in his studio in the way that he had the dance murals for Dr. Barnes, using paper, painted patches that he cut out with scissors and pinned to blue backing with thumbtacks. A white figure with arms flung out rides on the back of a yellow bird, liberated, it seems, to the consternation of the man on the ground. The theme of liberation of the soul is a matter of this ballet, and Matisse is going to use the technique as well as this kind of imagery in the last great phase of his career. Well, in his late 60s, Matisse has fame and money and skills that he's only begun to use. But being Matisse, of course, he's got fears that it may be all over for him. His wife will soon separate from him to his distress. But he has an indispensable helper in Delektorskaya and some emotional support from his children. Matisse had more than a flair for decoration. He had a deep respect for it. In France, décoration did not have the associations that it had in America and Britain, where it connoted lightweight and ornamental and entertaining, lacking in gravitas. It wasn't created with progress towards the presumed goal of modern art, that is, abstraction. But for Matisse, it was a high calling in life to give people pleasure, to transmit the joy he felt in what he was seeing and drawing and painting. For him, making art for public spaces, or even for important private places, was worthy work. Hilary Sperling, the biographer of Matisse, wrote, "A dismissive caricature of Matisse as a hedonist, incurably preoccupied by blue skies and odalisque, took root so deeply in the 1930s that it would be another half century before it could even begin to be dislodged." She quotes Clive Bell, the British critic in the 1930s. "Matisse is painting as rapturously as a bird sings," wrote Bell, using the mindless frivolity of birdsong to encapsulate the reasons why what had once looked like it was becoming the age of Matisse had turned out, in the end, to be the age of Picasso. Matisse, though, said in 1939, "I work without a theory. I work without a theory." At the end of a logical decade, he insisted that his art was primarily organic and instinctive rather than conceptual. Matisse again, "I'm conscious only of the forces I use, and I'm driven by an idea that I really only grasp as it grows with the picture." In 1938, he got a commission from Nelson Rockefeller, who'd just turned 30 and would shortly become the president of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, which is also young. It was only 9 years old at the time. Nelson Rockefeller had a new apartment with a very big living room and 2 fireplaces, one at each end. So he got Fernand Léger and Matisse to paint decorations to be set into the paneling. Lydia and a friend posed for the singer, and all three listeners there on the right. Music had a kind of spiritual as well as a psychological value for Matisse. He was a competent amateur violinist who could empathize with the attitudes of the listeners there, including the blonde, Lydia that was, leaning on the fireplace with her eyes closed. At the end of the 1930s, Matisse was living with pain and sleeplessness and sharing the general anxiety over the situation in Europe. Hitler was looking to invade Poland. Italy seemed likely to be invade from the south, I should say, and take Nice. The conference in Munich produced an agreement that soon proved to be delusory. Germany declared war, invaded France 25 years after the last invasion, which Matisse remembered very well from his childhood. He was tormented by chronic heart problems, bad digestion, his eyesight too, and family troubles got worse, particularly with his wife, who suspected that he and Lydia were having an affair, and rumors spread. Matisse managed all of this by avoiding it. In his studio, often sleeping there with an aviary and the jungle of philodendrons and beloved objects, and the total absorption in his work. The paintings were his solace, and they reflected nothing of the turmoil inside or the world outside. The paintings were a world of his own making, a world of music and polite pleasures taken in the company of women whom Matisse exaggerated to the point of caricature in the proportions of their feet and hands and in their expressions. There's a lot of gentle wit here, though. The flames she seems to sit on in the fabric covering the couch, for example, and the huge green leaves behind them, declaring once more that Matisse is free whenever he wants to seize whatever pattern he needs and make it as big as it needs for the purpose. So light and color and scale are relative, a matter of convenience, or they're part of the game. What's going on here, you might ask? Well, a woman with a familiar haircut and short-sleeved dress sits in a familiar pose. She's painted a flat, bright red, and so is her chair. And above her hangs a picture of another woman, modeled in light and shade, active, wearing nothing. In the middle is a white sculpture stand with a large blue amphora and a glass vase with daisies. On the table, 6 fruit, maybe pears, and on the right, a vertical band of blue, maybe suggesting sea or sky. I see a nice play of contrasted things here. The big block of red has visual weight. That's what Matisse called his ballast. Weight that creates a surprising equilibrium with everything else, which Mondrian would have called dynamic equilibrium. The 2 containers on the table match each other, but by contrast, the ceramic one is empty, it's opaque, it looks ancient, while the glass one is modern, transparent, and bursting with life. The modern woman sitting comfortably versus her wild ancestor above her. You can decide if I'm overdoing the analysis, but this is a picture that invites it, and I think rewards it. In 1941 and 42, after terrible suffering, Matisse had surgery for intestinal cancer, and he wasn't expected to survive. It required a colostomy and a second surgery, causing him to spend many months in bed. But being Matisse, he could draw there, and he did. First, he made prints and book illustrations, including radically minimal lino cuts here for a play about the Queen of Crete, who was the mother of the Minotaur, who was a difficult child. Matisse puts across her anguish simply by drawing her profile there in the middle, that amazing single undulating white line. In the summer of 1942, he started painting again, gradually to build up strength. He said he'd been given a second life. The few paintings are small, strange, even spectral. When Nice was threatened with bombardment and invasion, his helpers moved him out of the apartment in the city and up to Vence in the hills to the northwest and into a small house, the Villa La Rêve. And in the cold winter of 1943, working at the villa, Matisse could keep going, and mainly because Lydia did everything: food, fuel, nursing, plus work in the studio. Painting went on, and printmaking too. In June 1945, the Allies invaded on the Normandy beaches. Matisse got sick again, was out of action for most that year. His daughter Marguerite had been working for the Resistance, was captured, was tortured, and then came home. His estranged wife, Emilia, had been interned by the Gestapo, but she was free again, too. Paris was liberated, then Vence. As soon as he could, Matisse was back at work in the studio at Nice, this time with no more pain and with a new direction. He wrote to his daughter, "Paintings seem to be finished for me now. I'm all for decoration. There I give everything I can. I put into it all my acquisitions of my life. With paintings, I can only go back over the same ground. But in design and decoration, I've got the mastery. I'm sure of it." Picasso came to visit with his companion, Françoise Gillot. And she wrote, "When we arrived, we found Matisse armed with a huge pair of scissors, carving boldly into sheets of paper painted in all kinds of bright colors." Matisse had a Dutch guest who described him at his work. "There is nothing to resist the passage of the scissors, nothing to demand the concentrated attention of painting or drawing. There are no juxtapositions or borders to be borne in mind. And little creatures extracted from their element fall from the scissors in quivering spirals and subside like those fragile organisms, the sea leaves washed up on the sand." This was one of two 12-foot designs that he improvised on his own walls and then had demounted to have them reproduced by the fashionable London textile manufacturer Zika Usher, who commissioned printed fabric panels and scarves with Matisse's enthusiastic okay. For him, making multiples was fine. The original designs could go to museums. He prophesied to Usher, "You're doing something that deserves the same respect as a fine art print. It's destined to be famous. I'm sure of what I say." What was new for him wasn't the technique of cutting and pasting colored paper. You saw him do that in a big way as a shortcut to painting those enormous figures for Dr. Barnes and for the curtain and for the Ballet Russe. In July 1946, he wrote to his dealer in New York, turning down a contract for his paintings. He said, "I'm very sorry to have to tell you that I cannot accept your offer, tempting though it is. I'm going to drop painting in favor of decorative works such as tapestries and frescoes. It'll be some time before I paint canvases again, except occasionally." Meanwhile, he'd been busy with another cutout project, an illustrated book entirely by himself, text as well as pictures, entitled Jazz. That was his title. It combines his handwritten text and 20 pictures he made first as cutouts and then were printed as stencils. The French called them pochoirs, a technique that requires intensive skilled labor. It's a big book, 146 pages, plus index, including just 20 images. I say just because when it's displayed, it's almost always showing all the images and very little of the handwritten parts. The images are not illustrations to the text. Matisse insisted on that. He said that the text was there not to comment on the images, but to balance the spreads visually. In fact, the text is not just long, but it's valuable. It's a series of meditations on art, on the importance of the freshness and spontaneity, of love, of happiness, even of the eternal. And with experience, Matisse wanted for you is turning the pages, reading as well as looking, and maybe finding connections, maybe. So you can do a little bit of that now. You can also try to find yourself a copy of the facsimile edition the Museum of Modern Art turned out about, 20 years ago. It's not cheap, but it's worth it. The title, back up here for a sec, spread is a kind of welcoming figure on what seems to be a stage. He's Le Clown in a bodysuit with scary-looking spiky red decorations. The next spread puts a point on the circus theme with a great splash of letters. Jazz twice, cirque twice, I should say, and a cutout dancer in spotlight with arms and hair flying. Then comes some text, a solemn and half-serious disclaimer. These pages, therefore, will serve only to accompany my colors, just as asters help in the composition of a bouquet of more important flowers. Thus, their role is purely visual. Okay. Matisse identifies the stern head in profile as Monsieur Loyal, who's the traditional French name for the ringmaster of a circus. And yes, he does resemble Charles de Gaulle, for sure. Matisse puts the captions here like an index, kind of in the back of the book. This one may reflect a real story or be visual free association by Matisse, not sure. Here, waves and undulating horizontal shapes and sea blue and sky, recollecting faraway places in the warm Pacific where he'd been. The caption in the back simply says, "The Lagoon." In this next spread, mustn't forget Le Cowboy. Here, let me just see, let me go back for a second. Sorry. This spread, entirely written, he uses it for something heartfelt. He said, a musician once said, in art, truth and reality begin when one no longer understands what one is doing or what one knows, and when there remains an energy that is all the stronger for being opposed, constrained, repressed, then you have to present yourself with the greatest humility, candidly, with a mind as if empty. Now, here again is Le Cowboy, a popular performer in European circuses, roping a bad guy with his lasso, all silhouette and blaring color. And finally, a lesson from Icarus, who flew too high toward the stars until the sun melted his wings. Matisse's text describes an airplane trip he took and the sense of release he felt when he penetrated the clouds. For a moment, we felt so free. Shouldn't we encourage young people who have just finished their studies to take a long trip on an airplane? Jazz came out in 1947, and he would soon be making more and bigger cutouts and designing stained glass. You heard him tell his dealer that he was going to stop painting for a while, but in fact he wrote again to say, "I'm now making paintings with as much keenness as ever." And that he was. He's painted a bit of living room with a dog and a cat and flowers and familiar furniture, secure in their outlines, luminous. The wall and the floor are rosy red, which comes through the table at the right that stands on it. He's left the flowers in halos of light, just unpainted canvas, and put in a couple of his recent paintings on the wall, big, like the ones we're looking at. If it all feels a bit familiar, no wonder. It's Matisse recalling his own audacity 35 years later when he's pictured a little imaginary retrospective of his own in the studio and then decided to repaint the whole room red. Red in the painting, that is, making it even more imaginary. Now in 1948, it's all more spontaneous, less labored, more joyful. And that large black and white painting on the wall behind advertises, I think, a whole campaign with the brush and India ink that year, making a spontaneous-looking drawings of studios, scenes where the light is white paper and there's no shading at all. And that little head, one of many prints that he did with the brush, in this case with aquatint, a reproductive technique. My own favorite painting of this period, I have to confess, is this one, is a view past a curtain, out a window, not very far out the window. Right behind the window is an image going back 50 years in Matisse's career. Out the window, but only as far as that splash of palm fronds, as though the painter were saying, "Never mind what's out beyond. This is all you need." The burst of branches, the fruit on the table, the light in the room, gifts of nature that I'm revealing to you by drawing back my curtain. And the curtain itself is a wonderful transformation from plant forms in nature by some far distant, ingenious people. The black of the room gives the whole thing the flavor of a mystery revealed. I'm going to return to the cutouts for just a minute before we end. Matisse wrote that cutting directly into vivid color was like the direct carving of sculptures, and he'd often declared that for him to paint and to draw are one. As to the centuries-old debate over which was more important, drawing or color, Matisse insisted that the cutouts put an end to it. He probably would not have intended that cutouts were a step towards complete abstraction. In that belief, Matisse and Picasso were similar. Recognition of the subject matter, though, was part of the game. Both artists proposed to play for us. Zulma at the left is a cutout 9 feet high, way over life size, a sort of Moroccan odalisque. Matisse gives her a believable pose, an amazing display of virtuoso paper cutting, creating cape tables in perspective, vases with flowers and plants. He's added a few lines in a few places. And a couple of years later, he's denying himself any added lines. With these blue nudes, he's using only 8 or 10, 11 pieces of paper, cut out and spaced on the white paper to create lines that separate the body parts and suggest 3 dimensions, while the parts are themselves flat and unmodeled. This project drove Matisse and the studio helpers into a marathon of cutting and pinning and trimming and pinning again and moving and adjusting through 5 iterations. Some of you saw the marvelous exhibition of Matisse cutouts a dozen years ago at the Tate in the Museum of Modern Art, and how they made us aware of how his imagery has penetrated our lives through commercial graphic design in printed matter as well as clothing and merchandise. Matisse wanted to serve up surprise and pleasure in many different places and media. This is a cutout 25 feet wide that began on the wall of the studio and went all the way around to the next room. He was now over 80, and he wasn't strong enough to go outside in the garden, so, as he said, he brought the garden into himself. Pomegranates are dancing with philodendron leaves all over the surface. And above the photo of the artist, there's a parakeet. Matisse had a lot of those in cages. And up on the right, a mermaid, of whom he may have dreamed. He made a swimming pool in his dining room, too, with bathers and sea creatures floating and diving and cavorting, all pinned up by his faithful helpers and bursting out of the white band into the room. And here it is again, at MoMA, reconstructed and conserved. In the last 2 years of his life, Matisse made a few more huge cutouts. This one more than 12 feet wide, the size of major exhibition paintings. He called this one The Sorrow of the King. Matisse said, "The sorrowful king, a seductive dancer, and a fellow strumming on some sort of guitar, which releases the shower of flying saucers, the color of gold, go to streaming around the top of the composition and end up in a mass around the dancer in action." Is that a wonderful explanation? There have been some brave stabs at deciphering it, but I'll not try. To remind you of the scale of these cutouts, I've made a fake guard 6 feet tall for this gallery shot to give you an idea of the impression. These were pictures pushing the boundary of representation. Matisse described making this one. He said, "I first of all drew the snail from nature, holding it. I became aware of an unrolling. I found an image in my mind, purified of the shell. Then I took the scissors." So again, Matisse stressing the essence of a thing. In this case, partly from visual knowledge, it's coiled, and partly sense knowledge, it's unrolling. It was sensation that gave him the motive for the image. Here finally is the work of a period that Matisse, 82 years old, thought at the end was his masterpiece. A former nurse and model of his, Monique Bourgeois, returned to Venice in 1947 as a Dominican nun, now called Sister Marie-Jacques. She brought him one of her watercolors. He took it to a worldly Dominican monk he knew in town, Brother Reseguier, and brought along a copy of jazz. They got excited, and the idea arose to build a chapel on that site. This is the kind of public decoration that Matisse had not only dreamt of. They considered the possibility of hiring Le Corbusier, but Matisse nixed that, sensing that it had been hard for the Dominicans to stomach what Le Corbusier would do. He went to an experienced firm, the firm of Auguste Perret in Paris, who had recently designed a church in Le Racy in the eastern suburbs, the only comparable project at his time, an entire church built from scratch, an immense concrete church in this case, with acres of stained glass by Maurice Denis, Matisse's conservative and very Catholic contemporary, Maurice Denis, who advised him. But the new chapel in Vence would be tiny by comparison. Matisse was tireless and inexhaustible, demanding. He made himself learn everything from stained glass to drainage. He created designs in the way that he developed for cutouts, often prone, luckily spending very little time on ladders. The glass, when it was installed, radiated and radiates color. Blues, yellows, greens. It casts light across the white tile pavements and onto the tile walls, which have Matisse's large outline drawings, and here for the patron saint of Saint Dominic, and the Madonna and Child, touched by long streets of light that shift hour by hour, minute by minute. You're enveloped in it. You slow down, you sit down, and you let it work on you. At the far end, there are the Stations of the Cross, identified by Matisse's efficient system, thumbnail sketches, numbered 1 through 14, all the opposite of the elaborate pious imagery of the previous centuries. Part of Matisse's work were several sets of vestments that are there, I hope still on display in the room next door for you to look at. The building was consecrated in 1951. Picasso, a fervent communist, came to see the chapel and gave Matisse a very hard time about working for Catholics. He said, "So where's the atheist I once knew? Have you gone over to them?" Matisse took Picasso's anger gently, but he might have responded with what he'd written a few years before. "Do I believe in God? Yes, when I'm working." Matisse's last year and a half was slow, a slow decline. He was immobilized, isolated, fretful, attended by Lydia and visited by some very faithful friends. Alberto Giacometti drew him in the summer of 1954, not long before his death, sitting up in bed and looking indomitable. I think Matisse would rather have me end with a different image of him, sitting sturdily, pen in hand, and bathed in the light he'd created in his chapel. And I hope he'd forgive me for these reminders of him practicing his own sincere faith, working. For you in the audience, this has been many hours of listening and looking. And I'm deeply grateful for your attention. It's a gift to me. Thank you all.